Is this a video call or is it an
Yeah.
audio call?
Yeah, okay. Video call. And do you got a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Yes. Good. I see it.
Perfect. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. So honored with the guest that I have on today. In another one of our All Things Canada edition, we have Ken Stone, who is a member and founder of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, which is a superb superb peace organization, anti-imperialist organization. And what I really like about Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War is they're one of those peace organizations that's consistently against any war and some of the upcoming wars. So Ken, first off, thank you so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Youri.
Before we talk about before I talk to you about two specific issues that I wanted to talk to you about, NATO and the pivot to Asia, talk to us about a big online event. Well, a big online event, and I think also talk to us about this big event that you're organizing, which is related to Syria. Plug that for us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. So this Saturday, February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which would be 10 a.m. Pacific Time. I'm pretty sure it would be about 6 or 7 p.m. in Belgium, right?
Yeah.
We're having a webinar, a virtual panel discussion, in which we call Connecting the Dots. And we're trying to connect the dots between resisting the U.S. agenda in Ukraine with resisting the U.S. agenda in West Asia. So we're going to be talking about things such as the U.S. regime change war in Syria, such as the U.S.-Saudi war on Yemen, the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, the Caesar sanctions on Syria and Lebanon, and the tightening noose of the occupation on the people of Palestine. So we're trying to, as it says, we're trying to connect the dots. And this particular event is our coalition's contribution to the weekend of action across Canada to stop the war in Ukraine. So there will be actions in, so far, I think, 8 cities on the street, in-person ones, and ours is this time going to be a virtual action.
Fantastic. And fantastic. I completely applaud it. And that's exactly why I don't know if the audience could probably tell I'm a bit under the weather, but that's exactly why I wanted to even ignore my health problems to actually plug that event, because it is a very important event and it is happening this week. So I really wanted to give the opportunity to do it. And two of the guests that you're having on is Dr. Mara Osman, the brilliant journalist who does her program MIDI stream on Press TV, and Rick Sterling, who's been a guest on this program before, as well as Marwa. So folks should really check it out, and of course, I'll make sure to send the links to it so that people can check that out in the pinned comments section. And so that's a very great segue for me to ask this question, because as I mentioned, you're one of the few organizations which is consistently against war, because there's this bizarre thing where you have people who once upon a time would have marched against the Vietnam War. I assume they also would have marched against the invasion of Iraq, the second invasion of Iraq, and probably are against any kind of war in Iran. But now we see this bizarre thing where take Syria, for example. You have some of those very same people who are so gung-ho determined to overthrow the Assad government, and they're recycling Western propaganda. Even though I think anyone who does any elementary research into what's happening in Syria, it's Iraq, Afghanistan in the 1980s all over again. And then, of course, when we and of course, there's the very thorny subject of Ukraine, and of course, the oncoming war on China. Well, what we call the pivot to Asia. So, why do you think? Why do you think there is? Why do you think there is so much fragmentation amongst the peace movement, and people don't and people don't realize that all of these wars are imperial wars, and any uh, movements that the West is supporting, like, say, in Ukraine or in China, for example, with the Uyghur separatist movement or the Hong Kong independence movements or elements of the Taiwanese independence movements. Why don't you think people understand that the West is supporting the most reactionary movements? I know it's a very big, very big topic to chew on, but I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, you nailed it when you said that these are imperialist wars. And people need to understand what imperialism is. And imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And what it involves is the export of capital to other countries and making wars on other countries in order to grab natural resources and cheap sources of labor. And the U.S. has been doing this for a couple hundred years. After, the Brits did it before. Um, Now, when we look at the world today, and we look at, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, we can see that we are being fed a false narrative. If you want to put it simply, we are being lied to every single day by the governments and the Western mainstream media. They are trying to tell us a story that it's a boogeyman story. They did this for Iran, Iraq. They did this for Libya. They did this for Yugoslavia. That we are in danger because there's a madman named Putin who's a megalomaniac and he wants to build up a Russian empire and he's attacking the poor people in Ukraine. But if you have an anti-imperialist outlook, you understand that what's really happening is that the U.S. Since the end of the Cold War, since the Soviet Union dissolved itself, has been on the warpath. In 1990-91, what should have happened was that NATO dissolved itself when the Soviet Union dissolved itself, because NATO was set up to counter the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union no longer existed, NATO should have dissolved itself, and we would have had that famous peace dividend that we never had. And at the time, Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Baker, and other European leaders made a promise to Mr. Gorbachev that they would not expand NATO even 1 inch eastward of a reunited Germany. And a very naive Mr. Gorbachev accepted that. It was put in writing. And what happened was, as soon as the Soviet Union was dissolved, NATO, as I said, went on the warpath. They destroyed the Yugoslavian Federation in a series of wars in which Canada participated. There was a 78-day bombing campaign in 1999 in which the Canadian FCF-18 jets, the forerunners of our forthcoming F-35s, flew several thousand missions, killed thousands of people, destroyed a lot of infrastructure, and brought down the former Yugoslavia. Then they went on to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to Libya, and Syria. And in Eastern Europe, rather than not advancing even 1 inch eastward of a reunited Germany, the U.S. and NATO expanded 800 kilometers eastward and gobbled up 14 former Warsaw Pact countries and Soviet republics. And they went in 2014 under Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State. She boasted how it cost her government $5 billion to stage a coup. She spent $5 billion over 15 years to stage a coup in Ukraine, 2014, overthrowing the democratically elected government of Mr. Yanukovych, and installed a pro-Western, pro-NATO government that was riddled with Nazis. I mean, I'm not just saying Nazis like, I mean real Nazis, people who define themselves politically in terms of the Nazis who collaborated with Hitler during World War II, the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, and a whole bunch of other groups as well.
And their hero, and their hero, their icon, the Nazi collaborator of the time was Stepan Bandera. So we're not
exactly.
So you're not being hyperbolic when you're saying to people, guys, this historical figure that you know that's supposedly Western liberal EU loving Ukrainians keep lionizing. Come on, this this is a Nazi war criminal, right?
Who killed tens of thousands of Jews and Poles and Ukrainians of different ethnicities during and after World War II. This January the 1st, the Zelensky government declared New Year's Day as a national holiday, Stefan Bandera's birthday. And they had torchlight processions with Nazi swastikas and all kinds of the paraphernalia that goes along with neo-Nazism. So the government in Ukraine that came to power took away the language and cultural rights of the people living in the eastern part of the country in the Donbass. And you can imagine if a government in Ottawa took away the French language rights and the culture and all the institutions of the Quebecois or any of the Francophones across the country, there would be an uprising. And there was an uprising in the Donbass, which the coup government decided to put down by force. And that war started in 2014, and it went right up to 2022. And Mr. Putin, he didn't support independence for the Donbass region. He said what there has to be is peace talks to bring the Donbass back into Ukraine with some autonomy, full democratic rights, full language rights, the Russian language, to have their own parties, have their own institutions, etc. And he was able to persuade the Germans and the French to guarantee this thing that was called the Minsk agreements. And these were supposed to be to bring peace to Ukraine. But as we found out recently, neither Madame Merkel or Mr. Hollande, and certainly not Mr. Poroshenko, none of them believed in the Minsk Accords, and they all say now that they were bargaining in bad faith. They admit that they were bargaining in bad faith in order to strengthen the Ukrainian regime under Poroshenko, and to turn it into a de facto NATO country with a de facto NATO army. And in the December of 2021, the Russians issued some proposed treaties to the U.S. and NATO and said, look, let's just make sure that Ukraine is denazified and demilitarized. We can live with it. We don't have to. There doesn't have to be a war. But the U.S. and NATO disregarded these treaties. They did not even bother to respond to them. And in February, 1 year ago, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe, which was in charge of monitoring the line of control between the East and the West in Ukraine, they reported that there was a large number of attacks from the Ukrainian side on the Donbass. A huge increase, an 80% increase. There was an offensive coming. And up to that time, over the 8 years, 15,000 people in the Donbass were killed, or almost 18, maybe it was 14,000. But a sizable number of people were killed, and 1 million people were turned into refugees, and they fled into Russia. So in my books, I think that what the Russians did on February 24th of last year, I think I think that they were pushed in a corner and they had no other alternative. They turned around and said, okay, you disregarded all our warnings about your expansion eastward. You caused a coup. You overthrew a government. You attacked the Russian-speaking people in the Donbass. You massacred them. You are making an ethnic cleansing there. And you did not bargain in good faith. So we are going to recognize the independence of those republics, and we are going to go in and help them. And that's what they did. And I think that, from my point of view, I think that they were justified. I lay the entire blame for this war on the U.S. and NATO. And why would they want this war? And I'll tell you, it's because, as you say, if you are consistently anti-imperialist, then you look at what the U.S. is after. They had 30 years from 1990, 91 until today, when they were the sole superpower in a unipolar world. They got their way everywhere. They went through the Middle East and to Central Asia, and they laid waste the entire region. They set it on fire. They stole all the energy resources. They killed millions of people. They turned tens of millions of people into refugees. And it was all about energy, getting a hold of the major energy resources of the world. They didn't really need it for themselves because they're pretty well energy efficient, but they wanted to be able to turn the tap on and off to whomever they wanted. And now the reason that they are in Ukraine, the US and NATO, why they provoked this war, is because their goal, their imperialist goal, is to do to the Russian Federation what they did to the Yugoslavian Federation. They want to destroy it and gobble up the pieces, and then they want to move on to China. So, to put it simply, what the agenda, the U.S. and NATO agenda, is world domination. That's all. I can't put it any other way. In political science, they call it hegemony. Nice term, but the real word for people like us, the U.S. wants world domination. That's what the war in Ukraine is about, and that's why the U.S. Marine general the other day said that they are preparing for a war against China over Taiwan. So this is the Ukraine is round one. Taiwan will be round two in their books.
And one of these days, I'm gonna have to have you back on the program to talk about Yugoslavia because I think so many people, even those who claim to be anti-NATO, want to sort of gloss over Yugoslavia because they think of Yugoslavia as the good war. Many people still think of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War on Iraq, as the good war, when really the more you actually do like some research into it, and the more you actually talk to again the Ken Stones of the world back then, a lot of people will say, no, guys, this was another imperial war and you guys got fooled again. So when we talk about NATO, when we talk about the war in Ukraine, and when we talk about the pivot to Asia, which I'll just explain for the audience what the pivot to Asia is. The pivot to Asia is basically the West ginning up for a war on China. Hopefully, it won't get to a hot war, but the whole new Cold War, the efforts to support, Uighur separatism or Taiwan separatism, and even propping up Hong Kong separatism, for me, that's all part of the pivot to Asia, which is a war on China, because the U.S. Can't tolerate China being an economic rival to them, and of course they would like China to be like the Philippines and Indonesia, a client Asian state in which basically here you can have in which here we're going to exploit your labor, but we want to keep you as a client state. We don't you dare try to use whatever resources we've given you for free to develop your middle class and so forth like that. Is that a good way of describing the pivot to Asia for folks?
I think that's pretty accurate. I subscribe to it. I think that the main aspect of it is that the U.S. Is refused. It's a declining empire. It's an empire in decline, and what it can't accept is that it's no longer the sole superpower in a unipolar world. That there are now. This is now the world is now a multipolar world. There's a great power in Russia. There's a great power in China. These two countries didn't want to be seen as competitors of the U.S. They certainly didn't want to be seen as enemies of the U.S. And they went out of their way to be nice with the U.S. But all they got for it is being slapped. And so I think there's a new realization in Moscow and Beijing. They really can't play nicey-nicey with the U.S. because they're going to get slapped again.
Exactly. And in fact, I remember I had a Jeff Cohen, the founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, who and I don't. People who say that they're against the Russian invasion, I'm not. I don't get into arguments with those people. I understand why people have that political political emotional reaction. I mean, nobody likes to see wars. I personally think that the problem with Russia's invasion is apart from the collateral damage that does happen with any war. I find it only has further inflamed Russophobia, NATO, pro-NATO attitudes, and the far right, Russian movements of Eastern Europe. But I don't want to get into that. But I do. So I do understand where people are coming from.
I do want to get into that. I think that people have to understand that Russia is not the enemy. China is not the enemy. It's the U.S. ruling class, the military-industrial complex, that is the enemy of the people of the West. The people, from their point of view, this 1%, the people of Ukraine are merely cannon fodder, and they're throwing them against the Russian defenses, and they're in this meat grinder, and they don't care how many get killed. They don't care what happens to Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn in the big geopolitical game, and the sooner that people in the West understand that and see through the lies that Russia and China are our enemies, and the sooner they see that it's our governments that are waging wars all over the world and trying to destabilize whole regions, causing color revolutions in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, causing wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, making a regime change war in Syria. This is all part of the game. Actually, it was all put in the Rand Commission report in 2019. These are all the things that the Rand Commission told the U.S. government to do in order to destabilize and weaken the Russian Federation. So it's all part of a plan for world domination. And they don't give a damn about the human rights, the democratic rights, the lives of the Ukrainian people. They never cared about the people of Afghanistan for 20 years. They told us they did, especially the little girls who couldn't go to school. And they don't care. They didn't care about the people of Iraq. They murdered them, over 1 million. And they they didn't care about the people of Libya or of Syria. These are just places on a chessboard. That's all they are. And
exactly. What I was going to say is that is that even if Putin's not, even if you would never vote for, even if you were a Russian and you would never vote for Putin, because or even if you're not a fan of the Chinese regime for whatever, half truth you believe or whatever, nonsense that one does believe. The fact of the matter is that, that if you look at the Putin interviews with Oliver Stone, or if you, Putin says that actually, I actually, approached Bill Clinton and said that, hey, why don't we join NATO since, we're no longer, enemies and so forth. And the West basically said to him, no. And of course, with all the examples you've brought up, that every time that the Russians have tried, kind of giving some kind of an olive branch, the West has basically slapped, their hands away. And and not to go into deep into Cold War history, but it was also the same thing with China. I mean, the Chinese must be very baffled that, wait a minute, we opened up relations with you like in the 70s because we had, our Sino-Soviet split. Like, we've had like more or less peaceful relations with one another, exchanging, you guys, allowing your businesses to thrive in our country, us giving, students and allowing some of our best minds to even, become, American businessmen and so forth like that. And this is how this is how you repay us. So, but then that's, but then that's a good segue to this question, which is why then are some in the peace movement not being consistently anti-war? Like, what is it about the propaganda system of the U.S. and Canada that is making people that's making people, again, once upon a time, marching against the Vietnam War, even if they were communist leftists, or marching against the Iraq War, maybe not marching against the Libya War, but quickly realizing that, okay, this is another, imperial cannon fodder, to Syria, Ukraine, and the pivot to Asia, where you have very deep divisions amongst the peace movement and the supposed left, in which you have some people say that, like, oh, Russia and China are rival capitalists, they're rival imperialists, and I may not like my imperialists, but if I have to choose lesser evilism, I'm going to go for the West. So yeah, why? So why exactly? Why all this confusion? Why not the consistency of just being anti-imperialist and knowing that the West always supports the most reactionary movement? Ergo, doesn't matter what governments we like in this country or that country, we need to mobilize against our governments because as you've mentioned, imperialism, highest stage of capitalism and whatnot.
Well, the Western elites and their governments work very hard at manufacturing consent for their wars. They're masters at it. I don't think any time in history we've ever seen how comprehensive and overwhelming it is when they wage a war, that no other alternatives, no other ideas are even engaged. I haven't, with the war in Ukraine, for example, I haven't seen such hype and what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. I'm having a senior's moment, but in any case,
but I think
hysteria. Hysteria. That's the word I'm looking for. Hysteria over Ukraine. It went to the point that you couldn't play Tchaikovsky. That hockey players from Russia were supposed to denounce their government before they could play a game of hockey. You couldn't read Tolstoy. Oh, that's all. You couldn't do that. Everything Russian is bad, bad, bad. Putin is bad, bad, bad. He's the new Hitler. And they have a huge control over the media. It used to be we could get a couple of articles and letters to the editor into the Hamilton Spectator here in Hamilton, but even that they've completely cut us out of letters, op-ed pieces, anything. We had demonstrations. They don't cover them. It's like we don't exist. There's only one line, and that's all you get 24 hours a day. So the Western governments are very good at propaganda and in support of war. And but the thing is that and it was really hyper at the time when the war first started. Now, 1 year later, we've noticed that when we have a picket in front of the MP's office, or we disrupt the cabinet minister, as we did in the Art Gallery of Burlington when she's delivering a talk, and we hold up a banner and somebody makes a speech, we notice that there's people who are listening. And when we picket someplace, we notice that there's with our banners and everything about the war in Ukraine, people are beeping their horns and taking the leaflet and agreeing with us. But I think they're still too scared to actually open their mouths because they're afraid they're going to get smacked down.
Yeah.
So I've been involved in the anti-war movement since Vietnam, and I could tell you at the beginning of every war there is this hyper period where everybody's so gung ho for this war, and you can't say a word against it, um, and it enjoys, if in the opinion polls 60, 70, 80, even sometimes 80% of popular support. But 6 months later, 8 months later, when bodies come home in the body bags, and people are, or when right now when people are paying huge amounts to fill up their car, or to pay the hydro bill, or or trying to you know decide whether their children whether they should heat or eat in their apartments. um, People are starting to ask, is it really worth it? What is this about? Why am I paying for that war over there in Ukraine? What has it got to do with me? And so I think it is right at times like this that people are open. And that's the time when the anti-war movement needs to come along and say, hey, you're being fed a bill of goods, a phony bill of goods, a pack of lies. The real story is that this war was completely avoidable. The US and NATO created it. And the people in the West, are going to be made, because of the sanctions that they put on Russia, especially, we're going to be made to pay for it too, through the nose.
But it sounds to me though. I remember having Greta Zaro of World Beyond War when I was asking her the difficulties of trying to mobilize the peace movement. But it sounds to me what you mentioned Vietnam, and if we talk about Ukraine, that yes, there is in the beginning there's this pro war attitudes, but once the war doesn't go exactly as planned, as the powers to be want, that's when people start to become anti-war. But it sounds to me as if as if there's a bit of a selfishness, because it's not as if people are against the war. They're against losing the war and looking miserable. So do you think that if that all of these that all these people who want us all to stand by Ukraine blindly, and I only stand with the peacemakers of Ukraine, just like I stand with the peacemakers of the West, China, and Russia. But it sounds to me as if Canada, the U.S., and its allies had introduced a draft, would we see larger people, would we see like an endless membership of people wanting to join Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, the Canadian Peace Congress, or whatever anti-war organization? Because then it shows, okay, it goes to show you that people aren't really for war unless there's no unless there's no how can I say sacrificing sacrificing our own bloods for it, right? Or
Well, I can tell you that the fact that they had a draft in the States during the war on Vietnam created a vast amount of opposition to that war. And that's part of the reason that they don't have a draft anymore. They've just made it in the States that poor people have nothing else to do except go into the army, because there are no other opportunities in the States, but they don't have a formal draft. So I think that people would are starting to question this war in Ukraine based on a number of things. The inflation that they're facing. And number two is the danger of nuclear confrontation, because this war in Ukraine could easily morph into a wider European war, or into a world war using nuclear weapons, which would mean the end of human civilization. And a lot of people are not happy about that prospect. And every time that they up the ante, the West continues to up the ante with now battle tanks. And the next step is going to be fighter jets. it becomes more and more likely that this war is going to spiral out of control. And people are scared. People are starting to get scared. And so they're starting to ask questions. People wouldn't be asking questions if if their lives weren't being affected. And so wars do have a way of affecting the population in an adverse manner. And this is the time for the anti-war movement to go among the people and say, hey, what you're being told is a lie. This is really what's happening. This is a war. This is an imperialist war. This is a war that could have been avoided, and they're asking you to pay for it. And they're asking you to risk your children's lives and your grandchildren's lives. And they don't give a fuck about the Ukrainian people.
Exactly. One quick follow-up then on Ukraine before we talk a bit more about China and the upcoming events. Want to talk a little because I do want to talk a bit about Syria before we close. So then a follow-up question then on Ukraine. Do you see Ukraine ever going back to being the once maybe not peaceful but the once complicated country that it once was before all of this horrendous Western meddling? Because I know I'm often invited on the Barricade, which is a pan-Eastern European left-wing news outlet, and the editor-in-chief, the co-founder of the of the outlet, Boyan Stanislavski, he was saying to me that he doesn't think that Ukraine will ever go back to being the once united country, ignoring Crimea, because that Crimea I think is going to stay with Russia until whenever, but that Ukraine itself will never be the once united country it was. It'll be Western Ukraine allied with literally the West. Eastern Ukraine will either be one or two countries, one which will be part of the Russian Federation, and one which might just be its own country, which even if the West never recognizes, Russia and much of the international community of Asia, Africa, and Latin America will recognize this new Russian-speaking country. Do you think that's what's going to happen with Ukraine, or what do you speculate will happen? Because everything is still very unpredictable at the moment.
Yeah, that's the problem. Everything is very unpredictable at the moment, and I think in the next year we'll see which way things will go. It's quite possible that there will be a spring offensive by the Russians, and they might take the whole country. There might not be a Ukraine when this is all over. It's possible that they will decide to take parts of the country where Russian-speaking people live and just leave the rest of it to be on its own. I don't really know. Mr. Putin hasn't called me up to share his thoughts with me lately, so I'm at a loss, just as you are. But I think that from the Russian point of view, what they want to make sure is that whatever is in what is now known as Ukraine is either part of Russia or neutral, and not a threat to Russia, which what happened when Victoria Nuland spent the $5 billion to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine, which, by the way, when it became independent in 1991, had as one of the first articles in its constitution that it would be a neutral country. And people forget that. People forget that.
That they do. I didn't even know that. So, wow.
Yeah, check it out. So the Russians want to make sure it's neutral. Either they have it all, or it's neutral and it's demilitarized, so it's not a threat to Russia, and it's denazified, because the Russians have had enough of Nazis in the last 75 years or so. And I think that there may be, hopefully, some kind of time at which the warring parties decide to sit down and negotiate. And at that time, we'll see how things shape up at the end. But right now, we have to mention about Ukraine that the Russians started right away wanting negotiations. They had a tentative agreement signed in Ankara in Turkey back in March of last year. And Boris Johnson was sent from the West to go see Zelensky, and he managed to persuade Zelensky to ditch the tentative agreement. And then we just found out a couple of weeks ago that Naftali Bennett, who was prime minister of Israel for a few months, also volunteered. He volunteered to conduct peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And he was deterred from doing so by the West. So the Russians have been looking for a peace deal, but the West doesn't want it. And in Canada here, we have the most vicious deputy prime minister. Her name is Chrystia Freeland, and her grandfather on the maternal side was a Nazi.
Yeah.
And she says only good things about him. She says, "Oh, I learned everything I learned about politics was from my grandfather, my maternal grandfather." She said in her budget that the purpose of her budget and the money that was being sent to Ukraine, which is now $5 billion of Canadian taxpayers' money, is to, quote, vanquish Russia. And the Canadian government has made no effort whatsoever. The former, Canada, which has a reputation of being an international diplomat, has not done a single thing to try and bring the warring parties together at negotiations. Prime Minister Trudeau has not picked up the phone to call Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has indicated he would like to talk to Trudeau. And Melanie Joly has not picked up the phone to Mr. Lavrov. And there's a reason. The reason is that if they picked up the phone and they talked to them, they'd have to report through the media what the Russians actually said. And they don't want the Canadian people to know what the Russians say, what the Russian point of view is. They want that completely shut out. And that's why people like Tamara Lorenz went to Russia. That's why Dmitry Lascaris is planning to go to Russia in April. And we are planning to have an online forum for him a couple of days before when he can explain to the Canadian people, why am I going to Russia? And when he comes back, if we can get the support, we will have Dmitry go on a cross-Canada tour and say, "This is what I saw in Russia." We don't have government-to-government negotiations or communications. So people, it's incumbent upon the people to have people-to-people talks with our counterparts in Russia, and that's what the Canadian peace movement is doing.
But not get well. But it's just so blood boiling that it's not getting the coverage from the CBC, global TV, and stuff like that. But hey, this is why we need our own media, and this is why we have to bypass the gatekeepers and report on this. Otherwise, because humanity, existence as we know it really depends on it. Because once we go past that red line of nuclear war, there is no plan B and it's game over. So then my second to last question then is about China and the pivot to Asia, and I think the Chinese diaspora community, which has refused more or less to be weaponized immigrants for imperialism, it was very easy, after a while to sort of debunk the Hong Kong, protests as being, these nice, friendly, liberal left protests, which they weren't. And I think much of the whole Uyghur genocide narrative has been thoroughly debunked by many journalists and people who, and even, former special UN rapporteurs like Alfred de Zayas, who's been on this program before. A lot of that has also been debunked. Even though there still is a lot of xenophobia, which is very difficult to overcome. But I think the one issue which might be the one where it's going to take a lot of efforts to push back against is the issue of Taiwan. Now, personally, I personally think that, like, in order for the Taiwan question to stop being such a thorny issue, is I think, Taiwan should be allowed to be given a referendum on whether they want to, formally join back with China or be its own independent country. But if it is going to be an independent country, it needs to have neutrality, no foreign military bases at all on Taiwan soil and so forth. But I'm wondering what's your thoughts on Taiwan, and is there anything about Taiwan that you think needs to be debunked when speaking to a left-leaning audience or people who claim to be anti-war but have a blind spot when it comes to the pivot to Asia?
Well, okay. I think you said right at the beginning that people should be consistently anti-imperialist. And I think you yourself, Youri, should be consistently anti-imperialist. You have to remember that China was a country long before Canada, long before the United States, long before Britain. They have a history, a continuous history going back 5,000 or 6,000 years. And in the 19th century, the European powers plus Japan decided to attack and carve up China, make it yield concessions. It was occupied. It was stripped of its resources, and it was forced into humiliating circumstance. The Chinese call it the century of humiliation.
Yeah.
And the many different powers seized parts of China and tried to uh, tear them away and make them part of their own empires. Japan seized Taiwan, which they called Formosa, and they used that as a base for which to attack China during World War II. Since 1949, the Chinese have been very resolute that they are going to bring back into China all the parts that were stolen from it, like Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan. And they've been working at this very steadily, and they haven't had to. They haven't had to do most of these repatriations by force. These were done peacefully and with the treaties and constitutions and so forth and so on. Back in the 1970s, Trudeau, the elder, was among the first Canadian. He's not like his son. He had a little bit of independence from the U.S. empire, and he recognized, even before that, he recognized the People's Republic of China and opened up diplomatic and trade relations with them. And he also did that a little earlier with the Cubans, while the U.S. was completely refusing to recognize those two countries. And the basis on which Canada was able to open these ties, and later Nixon was able to do the same thing a number of years later, was on the basis of agreement of a one China policy. So Canada, the US, and later the UN all agreed that there was only one China and that the government of that one China, is in Beijing. And so whereas up to, I can't remember exactly which year it was, most of the countries of the world recognized Taiwan as China. Now, only 13.
And Taiwan was seen, and the government of Taiwan of Chiang Kai-shek was sort of seen as a government in exile, kind of like right. when De Gaulle was in England during World War II. He was seen as like the French government in exile. So when, no, I'll let you continue to explain.
Okay, so this one China policy is now almost universally recognized. It's recognized officially by the UN. It's recognized by the US and Canada. And so when they meddle in the internal affairs of Taiwan by sending Nancy Pelosi who went to Taiwan to promote the election campaign of the president. I forget her name right now. She was an independentista. She wanted to make Taiwan independent. That really pissed off the Chinese. And when she was there, the Chinese staged all kinds of military exercises around Taiwan just to show what they could do if they wanted to. But they didn't. They don't want to. They want a peaceful reunification. Later, our own Judy Sgro, Canada's Minister for Foreign Trade, followed in Nancy Pelosi's footsteps. And when she was there, she made a statement that Taiwan should become an independent member of the International Civil Aviation Association, whose headquarters are in Montreal, and I can't remember another organization. So she encouraged Taiwan to take on more and more characteristics of a sovereign state. So, could you imagine that, for example, that Canada would tolerate a Chinese fleet going and sailing around Vancouver Island all the time, and encouraging the people of Vancouver Island to arm themselves against the Canadian government in Ottawa, and sending them arms, and sending them a high-level representative saying, you really deserve more than being a part of a province of Canada. You deserve to be an independent country. I think that the powers to be in Ottawa will be slightly pissed off. but they don't mind doing that to Taiwan and China. And so I think we have to understand that once again, it's like Ukraine. The US, Canada, Britain, they don't give a damn about the Taiwanese people. They are just cannon fodder. And they are just a pawn on Brzezinski's grand chessboard.
Yeah.
And what Biden wants to do is, he said it already, that China will not become a greater economic power than the U.S. on my watch. That's why they arrested Meng Wanzhou under Trump. That's why they're going nuts about balloons that are flying across the country and using them as a means of creating xenophobia. And of course, they're also using it as a means to promote more money for NORAD, more arms and military spending. So they're constantly ramping up the attack on China, and what they mean to do is they intend to defeat Russia, and they intend to weaken China so that it's not in a position to threaten U.S. global hegemony. And that's the real reason what's happening there. Taiwan is part of China. It's been part of China for over 500 years, twice as long as Canada has existed. And most of the people on the island, or at least I think 40%, when they do public opinion polls, just want to be part of China again. The other, there's other strains in there. There's the independentistas, and then there's the ones who want the Chiang Kai-shek types that are still there, who want to take over China from Taiwan. But a good chunk of the people of Taiwan, just want to be part of China again, and they should be able to do that.
Interesting. And in fact, I was even going to reference an interview I did with my friend Fiona when I asked them about the whole issue of Taiwanese independence. They was explaining to me, there's some things you probably should know about Taiwanese independence, which a lot of lefties don't know. And when Fiona was explaining to me that when you actually that when Taiwanese independence folks talk about Taiwanese independence, it's not just, let Taiwan be a nice, neutral, independent country. No, you're empowering the most reactionary forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who would like to overthrow the Chinese mainland China and be in power again and have a nice pro-Western relations. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And just before we close, remind us again about this event that's coming up February 25th with past guests Dr. Maura Osman and Rick Sterling.
And also Dr. Atif Kabursi of McMaster University. He's one of the world experts on oil. And he also was the Undersecretary of State for the United Nations for West Asia for a number of years. So he knows the region. What we're trying to do is connect the dots between the war in Ukraine to events that are taking place today in the Middle East. Maybe at another time, we'll talk about connecting the dots between the war in Ukraine and the proposed war on China. That might be coming soon because the U.S. Marine General said they're already preparing for that war.
Unbelievable.
But we're going to concentrate on Ukraine and things that are happening in West Asia, like the war in Syria, the sanctions on the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, what's happening with sanctions on Lebanon, the occupation of Palestine, the war in Yemen, and people. You said you put it in the links in the
Yes,
chat or but people can also go to our website, which is Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War.ca. And it's right there, front page.
Fantastic. And one moment. And
this Saturday.
Yes. And now we normally end the program with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later the French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, and of course my hero, the late James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Ken, it's your turn to do this quick fire questionnaire if it's possible. So let's go. Ken, what is your favorite word?
Socialism.
What is your least favorite word?
Imperialism.
What turns you on spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically?
Nice walk in the woods with my dog or my grandchildren.
And what turns you off?
What?
What turns you off?
What turns me off? What turns me off is the fact that the environment is degrading all the time, and that in the face of an environmental collapse and in the face of global health crises, the countries of the world are waging war on each other when they should be working together to find solutions.
Completely agree. And what sound of noise do you love, followed by what sound of noise do you dislike?
I like the noise of the leaves the wind rustling the leaves of the trees in my backyard.
And what sound of noise do you dislike?
Jet planes flying overhead.
And folks should also join Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War's campaign to stop the ridiculous F-35 fighter jets. And what is your favorite curse word, Ken?
Oh man. I'm embarrassed to say things that I go around when I say when I'm really mad. So I'll just say, damn.
All righty. And what profession other than yours would you like to attempt to do? So if you weren't doing the brilliant peace activism, the teach-ins that you do, and the myth busting that you do, so if you weren't doing that, what would what profession would you love to do?
I would love to be either a cinematographer or a public official, like an MP or an MPP, but I never got the chance.
Oh, nice. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
That's a tough one. I would not like to be in the government, in the cabinet of Justin Trudeau. I don't think I could be a very good bootlicker.
And then final question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates? And yes, atheists and agnostics can answer this question.
It'd be nice if God were to say to me, "You did a good job, Ken. You deserve to be here."
Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 with Ken Stone, tireless campaigner with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. Folks, make sure to check out that February 25th event. I will make sure to link Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War link in the pinned comments section, as well as the events. Ken, thank you so much for taking taking the time out of the morning and early afternoon to come here. It was a real honor to speak to you. Hope this will be the first of many conversations, because there's so much more that we could have gone into, but we couldn't. But anyways, this will be the first of many conversations. But thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Anytime, Youri.